All right, I want to take the time to welcome everyone and thank everyone for being able to join us today for this amazing webinar. We're very excited, looking to jump right into it. And One moment. I apologize for the misread on that title. This is a webinar that will focus again on funding and funding diversity. I apologize on the misread on that title, and we have an amazing group of panelists with us here today, and we will jump right into those panelists and introductions in a bit. First, let's talk a little bit about NASTD. Who we are. As a nonprofit, we are a nonpartisan national association that was founded in 1992, represents public health officials who administer HIV and hepatitis programs that are funded by state and federal governments. Currently, NASTD is in all 50 US states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, 7 local jurisdictions receiving direct funding from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and the US Pacific Island jurisdictions. Our mission, NASTD's mission, is to end the intersecting epidemics of HIV, hepatitis, and related conditions by strengthening domestic and global governmental public health through advocacy, capacity building, and social justice. Our vision, NASTD's vision, is to see a world free of viral hepatitis and HIV. So our agenda for today, first, once again, we'd like to take the time to welcome everyone who has been able to join us for this call. We are very appreciative of you being able to take out the time in your day to join us and really dive into this conversation with us. For an overview of the things that we're going to be discussing today, first, we're going to really look into the issue of funding diversity from the perspective of funders, and then that will lead us into funding diversity from the perspective of a harm reduction program, making sure that we have a very well-balanced approach to the topics of funding diversity and program sustainability, and really both sides of the coin of things that we should be mindful of. Then we'll dive into what makes a good proposal. We'll explore success stories of programs who have achieved program sustainability through diverse streams of funding. Then we will look to unpack opportunities and challenges of acquiring diverse funding streams in the era of COVID-19. And then finally, we will look to leave off with a question and answer session. And I will say this webinar is being recorded, so it will be made available on our website following the call. With that being said, I also want to introduce you guys to our lovely panelists that we have here today. We have with us here Genoa Clark, who is a representative and program manager of Choice Health Network. We have Zach Ford from AIDS United. And we have Mary Pounder from the Comer Family Foundation. So we want to thank our panelists today for being able to join us and really help facilitate this conversation. With that being said, question one, as funders, what are some of the struggles that you've seen programs face in terms of funding diversity and sustainability?
Well, thank you, Virgil, and my fellow panelists. I think it'll be a really great dialogue, and I think we're looking forward to it. And please ask all the questions, everybody that's in the chat. So I think one of the first things that is really difficult is to start establishing relationships. And so relationship building as a whole, and I will say that the number one thing that I think about that I hear from people for the first time ever writing a grant is, I don't know where to start. So all I want to say is first, and I think Zach, you've got some good feedback on this too, is if it's your first time writing a grant, just breathe. You know, you guys know what you're talking about, and the stories and data alone will speak for itself. So Zach, I'm sure you've got some other thoughts on this too.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Virgil, and thank you, NASTD, for having me and other panelists on today. You know, I think my approach to grant writing and to recommendations on it is that it doesn't have to be a scary thing. I think that it's important to remember that you are the expert, right? Like, it's your program, it's your organization, it's your community. You know what's going on, you know what's needed. And you know how to respond to those questions. I think it's important to really review the RFP carefully, to not rush through it, to really look at, like, what are they seeking to do with this money? What's the whole goal of the RFP? What is this funder? What are their priorities? Consider the questions that they're asking you, and then prepare your responses accordingly. And I think it's important to be honest about your successes and challenges. I know that there are times in reviewing proposals where I get folks who are trying to gloss over like a specific challenge, or maybe they're like hiding something. And I think that it's a much stronger proposal when you kind of approach that head on and you say, look, these are the specific challenges we're seeing. These are the ways that we're working to address them. And so I think being upfront, being honest, and really making the connection between what you're doing and what the RFP is asking is really, really critical.
You know, I think, Zach, a really good point taken on that is making sure that you also aren't stretching your mission, right? So one of the things that I think, particularly at AIDS United and Comer Family Foundation, like we value and love harm reduction and syringe service programs, right? So we already know what you're doing. You know, there's new grants out there, new opportunities, and we're just always worried and concerned about organizations that are maybe stretching themselves a little bit too far, particularly with other funders, right? Where maybe they say that they're focusing on mental health and substance use, but maybe they're not ready for harm reduction yet. That doesn't mean that they aren't. We'll get there in a little bit later, but just being really thoughtful about making sure you're not stretching yourself too far to meet the goals of that funder's types of missions. Another thing that's really important too is making sure to not assume, particularly if you're applying to AIDS United and Comer, like don't assume that we actually know all the cool and interesting little details of your particular community and the drug trends that are happening there, or the use trends. You know, some cities are real hot on shorts, some are hot on longs, right? Some are more smokers, some are more snowders, more injectors. So like those types of trends, or even just new types of drug trends that are happening, are really important to us, and we want to learn about that. I'd also say, in terms of struggles, communication, right? Please don't assume that we're always following nor able to keep up with all of the Instagram and Facebook and social media, Twitter posts. We deeply rely on you actually contacting us and letting us know what's going on at your organization. It's okay, like Zach was saying about challenges, and it's okay. Like, you know, we hope that there's a two-way dialogue here. And so if you need to restructure your grant making, particularly now on COVID, right, and redeploy your resources, it's okay, right? Just call us, and transparency and mutual trust go a really long way.
And I think, Mary, that's such an important point. You know, one of the things that I like to remind grantees is that we're partners in this relationship. Like, I fully recognize the power imbalance there, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that we're partners in this, right? Like, AIDS United's mission is to end the HIV epidemic, and we do that through strategic grant making. And so that mission includes working with organizations who are doing things like running syringe services, like running advocacy campaigns to expand syringe access. And so we see our grantees as partners in this work. And I and my other colleagues at AIDS United, I think, would say the same thing, are here to support you in that. So, I mean, if you're facing challenges with, you know, your board, if you're facing challenges with a community agency, we want to hear about that, and we want to see how we might be able to assist. I really like, Mary, that you pointed out the social media stuff. Like, I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Instagram, I'm not on Twitter, and so I need to hear the information directly from grantees. And I think it's much better to kind of be proactive about some of that stuff, like reaching out to your funder in advance, being like, hey, like, this is something that might happen, or this is a challenge we're seeing, or even if it's like, you know, there's this thing that might come out about, like, in the community or in the organization, like, like we lost this contract or whatever it is. It's good for us to have a heads up about that, because then we know how to help you through something like that, if there's a role for us to play.
Yeah.
And I would also say, along with communication, like read your grant contract. I think, when we're talking about challenges around sustainability, especially, I'm not the most strict about this, but there certainly are funders who are very strict about it. And, there's things in like, I don't know, our grant contracts are like 5 pages. I know there are people at Age United that have spent a lot of time working on the language and the agreements that go into them. And there's a lot of important information in there. Things like when your reports are due, things like, if there's an executive transition, like what the protocol is for notifying Age United. And it's most likely that other funders have similar protocols in place. And it's just to kind of keep up with what's going on. And so definitely read that contract.
And that's usually where it's noted what the beginning and end date of your contract is, and also when reports are due. And I know that sounds really silly, but that's often probably one of the most frequently asked question is, when am I eligible to reapply? And all that information is actually in the grant agreement. And keep in mind that sometimes I think people think that we I don't know, I guess it's hard to say. We have many people that we work with, right? So I actually, on a national level, work with over 200 grantees. And so sometimes it's a little challenging for me to always get back to you so quickly. So it's just a little heads up. So sometimes it might be actually faster if you go back and look at your grant agreement. But anyways, so should we talk a little bit, because we talked a lot about relationship building, Zach,
Yes.
and Virgil. What about just securing funding when fringe service programs are not legal in a particular state? Would that be helpful?
That very much would be. I know that that's a very big real reality for a lot of syringe exchange programs who are looking to do the work. And I'd like for you all to really, as much as you can, speak to that. Like, how do we really have conversations about funding diversity and program sustainability in that context?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging thing, and I think it's something that we're constantly addressing. And I think certainly, Mary and I don't have all the answers, but I do think it's important to kind of recognize that organizations like Age United and Comer are really comfortable supporting organizations that are running underground services or that are running services in states without legal syringe exchange. Like, that's fine for us. We do that regularly. I think one of the things that I like to tell applicants when they're applying or they're thinking about applying, because I'll get questions around like, how much should we put into this proposal? Like, how much should we reveal that we're doing? Recognizing that even if you're in a state with legal syringe exchange, like there might be some other things, some other really critical services that you're running that that might not be legal yet. And so I like to remind folks that, each funder is different. So there's different types of ways that funders will review proposals. So for example, at Age United, we do what's called participatory grant making. So we have committees of folks from the community that review our proposals. And so I oversee that process. I don't actually review proposals. That's put to the committee. And the committee does sign a confidentiality agreement, but I think it's important to remember that, like, I don't have any control over whether they break that agreement. We do have a policy that if the agreement is broken and we know it's broken, that person's never invited back. And so, we really like to protect that. And I think because it's community members, they understand what could possibly be at stake there. But it is important to know, like, who is going to see this proposal? Is it just going to be the project officer that I'm submitting it to? Is it going to be a panel of community members? Is it going to be a board? Is it going to be like other staff at the agency? And those are questions that you can ask during the application process.
Really good point, Zach. I think, at Comer, it's a much smaller board review process. It's internal. And so, but I think that's a great way to put it. Like, people should be getting to know their funders in different ways, right? And asking those questions about whether, what is the formal review process, and is it internal or external? You know, and it's okay to speak with funders in advance of submitting an application. In fact, if they're agreeable, and I know Zach and I often have the time and are agreeable to speaking with you because we want to get to know you as well. But definitely try to talk to the funders in advance. And it also gives you that chance to kind of do like a little bellwether to figure out like if they actually understand what you're talking about. And, you know, if you're unsure, perhaps writing the grant agreement to just highlight just general harm reduction in all of the work that you do. So, you know, you guys do all sorts of things, right? Like you're doing peer support and you're connecting people to housing and jobs. You're doing wound care, HIV and hepatitis C testing. You know, there's a lot of work that the program does outside of perhaps the direct syringe itself, that would be something that I would recommend highlighting, is all of the wraparound services and work that your organization does. It's also very thoughtfully, it's also very helpful to think about private funding. So AIDS United and Comer, we're private funders, right? And so because we're private funders, like it's a little bit more flexible typically, and hopefully they're general operating grants. So anytime you get a general operating grant, like that's kind of that's your golden cover of you make the decision because we trust you in how to best use those funds for your organization. And I hope and I do believe that more and more funders are moving towards general operating. It doesn't hurt to ask that question. And, you know, I would say the funding community is putting pressure on themselves to do that as well. You know, another thing to think about, so, and Jenna, I think you're going to talk about this in a little bit too, about just like, you know, just like choosing who's the right funder for you, think about who the right fiscal sponsor is too, right? So some of you might be brand new and you haven't yet set up your 501c3, and that's okay because that's a process. But making sure you choose the right fiscal sponsor. There are some fiscal sponsors that are fantastic. They absolutely know harm reduction. And we could put some perhaps in the chat, or maybe folks can put it in the chat, right? And you kind of know who they are. There's at least 2 or 3 out there. But there are some that maybe don't necessarily always understand what harm reduction is. And so I just encourage you to think a little bit about your relationship with your fiscal sponsors when you choose them.
I also think on fiscal sponsors, I mean, remember, like you don't have to go with the first group that you meet with or that you interview, right? Like this is your decision. You can shop it around, you can interview different groups, you can ask questions about their fees, what the fees cover, what you'll get out of the relationship, what they do when you're ready to establish your own 501c3, like what is their process for kind of separating. So there's a lot of questions you can ask, and I'm always happy to chat with folks about this because I've seen it a number of times with grantees. I've seen some go really well, and I've seen some not go well at all, and it's a really significant challenge for that organization, and can kind of be a really toxic thing for the staff and the participants. So definitely ask lots and lots of questions and interview different groups.
All right. Well, just to make sure that we are keeping current with time, thank you, Zach and Mary, for that thoughtful insight. We're going to transition and keep with that same pace and energy with question number 2 for Genoa, who I believe I mispronounced that name earlier, so I do apologize for that. And I also want to remind folks who are on the call, feel free to insert all of your questions into the chat box, and at the end of the webinar, we will most certainly have a Q&A session, and I'll seek to address those in an appropriate amount of time. But for our second question, I want to open up the floor, the virtual floor, for Genoa Clark. As an operator of a harm reduction program in Eastern Tennessee, could you talk to us more today about the history of your program and how you were able to really incorporate and use diverse funding streams to provide services and improve program sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Virgil. I'm really honored to be on this panel. I don't spend my days doing webinars normally, so this is my first one, bear with me. But I really am excited to be here. Like you said, my name is Genoa and I work with Choice Health. We're here in Knoxville, Tennessee. I just want to give a brief kind of organizational overview so y'all understand the context, because we are not, I am within an organization, a program within an organization, which I know might be different from a lot of folks' context where they are at. So Positively Living and Choice Health Network were founded in the 90s as an HIV and AIDS service organization, and they provided case management and emergency and supportive housing, but we've grown a lot over the past 2 decades. We now have a medical clinic that provides care for folks living with HIV. We also do PrEP and PEP services. We have case management, we've added mental health, and then the last kind of program offering we've added is our harm reduction program, which is my kind of bread and butter. And we provide prevention services like PrEP navigation, we do syringe access, we provide naloxone, and we also do HIV and Hep C testing. But we have not always had those components. We started very, very, very small. So I thought I would talk to you a little bit about how we got started and how we got where we are now, and how diversifying our funding streams really allowed us to do that, quite frankly. So when we do presentations, I talk about having a braided funding stream, which I think is just a nice way of saying that we have a little bit of funding everywhere going to the same type of programming. And I think probably lots of harm reduction programs are familiar with that. It is an approach of necessity a lot of the time, but I do think that it can be beneficial in some ways also. In 2017 in Tennessee, our syringe service law passed that allowed legal syringe service operations. And then the next year, they did the first round of state funding for programs, and we were one of those 3 agencies that got funded to do that. So full disclosure, state funding was and continues to be really the foundation of our work. That was kind of what allowed us to start growing. In the last couple of years, though, we have been able to expand our services, expand our reach, and also expand the volume of people that we're able to serve through a lot of supplemental funding sources, including state support, also just more state support for resources, and also in-kind donations. And I know those things aren't funding necessarily, but I feel like it's important to give a realistic picture of all the places and all the resources that you have to pull from to kind of develop a program, which is really hard to do. And I know lots of you are doing that right now, so props to you. Just to talk a little about what that kind of expansion looked like from what was a van parked in a parking lot with 2 people working on it and a few people in line to what it is today is that we got private funding to kind of pivot to more of this health hub model, which is also, you know, much more marketable where we are, which is East Tennessee, to say that we're providing lots of services and not just needles, although we know that that's the backbone of our work, but it really helps to be able to show these other maybe more traditional like health services that we provide and how those are important for folks. So that includes HIV and Hep C screenings, and we also got funding, private funding to do on-site reflexing to confirmatory Hep C testing. So trying to keep everything in one spot so folks don't have to go to the health department, to the hospital, to a doctor. They can just come to us and get a lot of what they need in one place. That grant funding also allowed for us to hire a nurse to do that phlebotomy, which is, that was exciting to have a harm reduction nurse, and I think was a really interesting experiment for us to build that community trust. And the funding also allowed us to fund the labs that are associated. So we're talking about really medical stuff, which is totally different from funding that we apply for needles, totally different from funding we apply for staffing sometimes. It's kind of just like going where you see what lines up between what your funders are looking for, as Zach and Mary talked about, and what you're looking for. We also have, the state provides us with rapid tests and the training for rapid tests, which is really helpful. Again, not a funding source, but it's important to look for resources where you have them. And our state is very on board with testing. So they're happy to kind of provide us that and allow us to expand in that way. We also have donated naloxone, which was truly a game changer for our program and our community. We were giving out about 10,000 doses a year, and now we're up to about 30,000. So this is a huge change. Again, not necessarily a funding source, but just different types of resources to help you meet the need of your community. And then unrestricted funding, which is always our favorite, it's everyone's favorite, really let us get the stuff that's hard to pay for, quite honestly. So that's things like fentanyl test strips, wound care supplies, safer use supplies, beyond injection, so smoking and snorting supplies. And I think to speak to Zach and Mary's point, you kind of feel out the comfort level of the folks that you work with and what the proposals are looking for, because those are things that you know you might want. It's just you have to wait to find where will allow you to do that. And we also use unrestricted funding for increasing needles because our state legislation disallows any public funds to be used for needles. So those are really, really hard for us to fund and are the most expensive part of our work. I'm sure as many of you know, after you pay your staff, needles are the thing. So that was a good lesson to learn. But really what that diversified funding allowed us to do is just increase our capacity. January 2019, we were serving about 100 people a day. And this January, pre-COVID also, full disclosure, but this January we served about 200 a day. So because we had these different funding sources, I mean, it's very simple. It just let us get the staff time and the supplies that we needed to be able to grow in huge part because our funders gave us the resources to do that. And then also last year we got our first federal grant, which was a huge turning point. And that allowed us to start planning to expand services into more kind of conservative rural counties around our metro area. But that was a big moment for us because we always felt like the little scrappy underdogs, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But you can't really say that once you have a federal grant. So it was exciting, but also has totally reframed how we work and where we apply, which I'll talk about a little bit more too. Just a reminder of how much we've grown over the past couple of years. So a few takeaways about funding and program sustainability that I wanted to share with you all. I do not think I'm the expert on this, but I think there's things that I wish our team had known 2 years ago that I hope will be helpful for people who are first starting especially. The first one is, and I'm sure you've heard this, but the first one is pay yourself for the work that you're already doing. And there's a couple parts to this, but the first one is make sure you are paid, your staff is paid. If you have peer support workers, that they are paid for their contributions, and that everybody who's engaged in providing services can also provide for themselves, provide for their families. I mean, you can't do anything unless you have people working. And I know a lot of you are probably the backbone of your work and maybe the only person there. So that seems silly, but don't overlook it. You have to find a way to make it sustainable for you too. And the second part of that is funding the work that you already do. So what are you doing now? How can you tailor your proposal to make sure that you're not always just adding more work to your workload? It's kind of like, to me, I don't know if this will be well received, it's kind of like tweaking your resume a little when you apply for very different jobs. Like the content's still probably the same, the work you're doing is still the same, but how do you frame it and how do you pitch it without going so far off base that your vision doesn't really align with your funder's vision? Like there's definitely a way for you to tailor what you need funded to match what the funders are looking for, I think. And also to not just propose brand new programming every time you have a grant, because you will write yourself into a hole and then not be able to actually staff those programs and provide those services. The second thing I want to talk about is just that not all money is good money. Again, I know this sounds very silly, but I wish that I had heard that before I started writing grants. My boss says to me a lot, money is a tool, not a goal, which is a huge privilege to say once your basic needs are met, that it's a tool, not a goal. But often I think harm reduction programs, including us, you're just so used to coming at it from a place of scarcity, even once you're off the ground. But like there's some money that's not worth it for you, that really isn't. And I think those reasons might be your funders' values don't match with your organization's values, or their mission doesn't match. Maybe the reporting requirements are totally unrealistic. Like think about it in your most pessimistic view, because once you start working on a grant, it's going to get a little bit crazy for you. So are you able to actually meet the requirements? And also something that I think about a lot is, what is the burden of actually applying for the grant? Like the federal grant is great, but I took weeks and weeks of work to work on it. And if I didn't have a team who could help kind of shift that workload, then you wouldn't be able to do it. And so I think you grow into those things too. Maybe that changes over time. But if you're one person trying to start up, I mean, you have more limited options. If it's between writing a grant or getting the work done, you're always going to want to get the work done, I think. So there's something to weigh. The last thing I want to talk about just really briefly is that rejection isn't personal, which I'm saying this as I take it really to heart for everything. But you are going to get rejected from a lot of things you apply for, unless you have incredible good luck, in which case You probably don't need to hear anything that I've said so far, but you can always make a better proposal and try again. We've been rejected for grants 1 year, regrouped, gotten feedback. Zach and Mary are talking about communication, so important. If you can access funders before you apply for grants or after, and be able to get some feedback on what's in your proposal, what could make it better, what could make it stronger, then you will feel much better going into it next time and have a much better shot. And also just that eventually your program is going to grow, probably, and to reevaluate if you're applying for funding in the right places. Maybe you have the history now, maybe you have the credibility now, maybe you have the legality now, maybe the laws have changed and you're legal, and you can expand your proposals to more of that public money, I would say, that's available. Mary and I actually had a really good conversation. Mary, I'm throwing you under the bus like you requested about this over the last couple of weeks, but our organization has been a Comer Family Foundation grantee in the past, and we didn't get funded this year. But I'm so thankful that our program funding has grown and diversified enough that getting Comer funding would be amazing, but it's not necessary to keep our program going like it once truly would have been. 2 years ago, that wasn't the case. When we were originally funded, we really needed that just to be able to provide basic services, to be able to give people needles. That's what we needed. But I want to talk openly about it because I think getting rejected for funding feels very discouraging, especially if you're a sensitive person, which you probably are if you're doing harm reduction work. And you can talk to funders. That communication just keeps coming back up. Talk about what they're looking for. If you get rejected, it'll be helpful. Thanks, Mary, for being willing to talk. And now we're on a panel together, which feels very funny and full circle to me. But I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's questions. I hope hearing from a program like ours is useful in some ways as you think about how to grow and how to fund the incredible work that I know lots of you are doing, often for very little money or no money, all the time. And I think that this is a very unique type of situation where you have to pull from all these different places to fund the thing that you think should be very easy to fund and seems obvious to you. And I know that can be really frustrating as well as hard. Like, it's hard, but it's also frustrating that you can't just pay for the work that you want to do. But I'm always available. Would love to talk to any of you on here or offline to talk about how you grow your program, because sometimes it helps to have somebody with a different perspective. When you're in it, it's a lot. It's really hard to be applying for grants all the time and trying to figure out how to do the work that you want to do. But I am really happy that I was on this call and appreciate all of you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to ask.
All right. Thank you, Genoa, for that great response. So we want to touch on something that Mary actually suggested in the first question that was being answered. You suggested, Mary, to for those who are just starting off writing your first grant, just breathe. Okay, so my question that I will pose to the group is, what are some things that you feel make a good proposal? Oh, back to question 3. No, 3. I'm sorry, I apologize.
That's okay. We know what the question is. That's good. And Genoa, you're so gracious, and thank you. The calls are hard, right? When we have to part ways, and I just want to say thank you. And it's hard for us to make those decisions too. And most times, all the proposals are great, right? There's a few that stand out, and I think Zach and I are going to share a little bit of feedback on that. But in any case, I just thought, it isn't personal, and it's often usually because of, increased funding or other resources available. So I just thought it was helpful to be able to wrap that up. But what makes a good proposal? Okay, first and foremost, the first thing that I look for, and I'm confident Zach does as well, is making sure that your application is layered with non-stigmatizing language and is just all the beautiful harm reduction best practices layered within, including making sure that it's either led by people who use drugs or at least at minimum meaningful involvement of people who use drugs, including people of color, right? Particularly if you're in a community where the highest incidence of use is in the African-American community, they should be represented within your proposal in terms of actually decision-making processes. Another thing too that has been really important to us lately, and it's been really fun to see how folks are doing it and the creativity is really coming out, but making sure that we have this Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBT, like just culturally affirming materials, right? Like, and I'm talking anywhere from like your print materials to making sure that you have wraparound support for individuals, making sure that you even have the right supplies for folks, right? Whether they're hormone injectors or silicone injectors, snorters, smokers, right? Like you name it. We're always looking for best practices to be kind of layered without, right? So while we love needs-based programs and we believe that that's the #1 goal, we recognize at times that maybe that isn't always possible. But if you can share why it's not possible, that would be helpful, right? Like our state mandates a 1-to-1 for funding, right? Okay, but we want to get to needs-based, right? Things like that are very helpful. And then finally, I guess a few things is just, I think you'll probably hear this multiple times, but honesty, transparency, but storytelling is gold, right? Those quotes that you guys share from participants are just amazing. That's the stuff that stops me in my tracks when I read really good proposals. And I always love a good, innovative, and like super progressive idea. That's where philanthropy can step in. We all know feds, the state and local governments can't always fund progressive and innovative ideas. That's where local philanthropy can help.
Yeah, wow, there's so much really great stuff that's been said. I want to respond to all of it. There were a few things that came up when Genoa was speaking that I wanted to circle back to. So one is the sustaining existing services before expanding. I think that this is so critical. Before you go after a new program, adding new things, making sure that your existing services have the funds that they need. You know, operating grant to grant is really, really hard. And I know that a lot of the organizations in this space do that. And I recognize that, you know, not getting funding from a normal source like the Syringe Access Fund or Comer can, honestly, it can break a program, and it can be really, really challenging. And so I think it's so critical to look at like, okay, what are your like primary services? What is the most important thing you're doing? And making sure that you have funding year after year to support that primary work before you think about like adding in new stuff. Of course, new stuff can bring in new money and new services can bring in additional funds that can support those primary services. But I think that that's a really important point. The other thing that I really liked was don't apply if you don't match the criteria that they're looking for, right? Like the Syringe Access Fund, our RFP states like our priorities. And, you know, we have a priority on organizations that are like small grassroots organizations working in states without legal syringe services. So if you're, you know, a gigantic FQHC in a state with legal syringe services, it might not be the best fit. And you should really think about like, by you putting forward an application, like who you might be taking money away from. So consider like what the funder is asking, consider what their priorities are, and make sure you're an appropriate match for that. When it comes to a good proposal, I mean, I agree with everything Mary said. I think for me, the most important thing is that people who use drugs are involved in your work, hopefully leading it. Hopefully they're in the decision-making roles, and hopefully they're the ones writing the proposal. And so it just comes through that like, this is what our program is. And I think that for those that aren't doing that or that can't do that at the moment, the meaningful involvement piece, like you need to demonstrate to me how folks are meaningfully involved at your program if you want support through AIDS United. Meaningful involvement is a core principle of everything we do, and that includes the Syringe Access Fund. And I think also, you know, the representation, the racial equity, you know, AIDS United uses a table. It's called a representation table, not a fancy name, but you know, we ask, it breaks down like, what's the composition of your board? What about your executive team? And then senior staff, mid-level staff, frontline workers. And then we also ask about the demographics around your, the communities that you're working with. And it's not so much that we want to see like, it's that we want to see appropriate representation, right? Like if the community you're working with is like 75% queer men of color, then like your executive staff and your board should reflect that. Because like if your board and your executive staff are all straight white men, like they don't know what's going on, and they're not putting in the appropriate programming, right? And so we know that, and so that representation table is one of the most important documents that we look at when we think about funding an organization. Gosh, beyond that, what did I? So realistic expectations. I love big, grand ideas. I think they are exciting. I love seeing them come through, but there has to be like realistic deliverables attached to it. There's got to be a realistic expectation for like how the money is going to be spent. And there's got to be a strong connection between the deliverables you're proposing and how you're proposing spending the money. Time after time, I see proposals that the narrative says one thing and the budget says something completely different. And I recognize that in some organizations, you know, it's a program staff person who's writing the proposal, it's a finance staff person that's putting together the budget. And that's fine, but you got to talk and it's got to match up. So, you know, if you're saying like, we need money for syringes, and then I look at your budget and it's all for staff, like that doesn't make sense to me. And it's things like that, because these reviews, these proposals, like it's competitive, because unfortunately there's not a whole lot of private money for this work. And so it's things like that that can kind of put one proposal ahead of another when we say, well, I don't know what this person's proposing because the budget says one thing, the proposal says another. And you don't want to make folks ask questions like that. I would say another thing about a good proposal is demonstrating a collaborative approach, knowledge of your community stakeholders. So, you know, I don't necessarily need to see that you're working with like local or state agencies, but like you should know about them. You should know like how they lean, what they think about the work you're doing, where do you have support? Who are your friends? Who is going to challenge you? And like, what are you going to do if that happens? I mean, it's great to see like that you've engaged with those folks, but we also recognize the reality that that's just not possible in some places because of reluctance to harm reduction services. But you should still be able to say like, this agency isn't open to this because A, B, and C, and have that knowledge. Yeah, other stuff?
No, that is actually, unless any of the other panelists wanted to get something in, 1 minute and 18 seconds left on that note.
I was just gonna say, make sure it makes sense. Like Zach, you already kind of spoke to this, but like, make sure it makes sense. Have somebody who's not you or in your program read it. If you have a participant advisory board, have your participants read it. I know there's like some lingo that maybe not everyone understands, but like, does the big picture make sense? Does the proposal match the budget? I really relate to that and see it, and other people will catch your mistakes or the things you overlook. That's all.
And they'll also be able to be that gut check about whether or not you're meandering and going on and on and on, right? Like, you know, a boss once said to me, if you're explaining, you're losing, right? So it was like, oh, like, how do you make it more condensed and more tight to try to figure out to get your message across?
Certainly. All right, so moving on to question 4. So to the funders, what are some success stories in terms of program sustainability that you can share with us today?
I mean, I'm happy to go first this time.
Go for it.
So in terms of program sustainability, success stories, so I wanna start out just by raising that like getting too big too fast can be a barrier to sustainability. I know we've kind of talked about like the need to sustain existing services, sustain critical services before moving on to new stuff. And you know, like a big like $300,000, $500,000 grant like sounds really appealing, and it is like I think that that's really exciting when organizations get that, but also recognizing that like it can be really challenging to scale up that quickly. So just know the limits of your organization, know the limits of your staff. Managing those large grants requires a lot of oversight. And the higher the investment, the more strings that may be attached to the work. So really know what you're getting into with some of those like high dollar amount grants. What sort of data are you going to be required to collect? Is it stuff that you want to share with funders? Is it stuff that your participants want to tell you? Know like what sort of evaluation metrics are attached. Do you have staff that can actually do evaluation? Is the funder going to pay for it? You know, grow at a pace that works for your organization and works for your staff, because I think that we all know what burnout looks like. I think that we've all probably experienced, and there may be a number of us on this webinar today that are experiencing it right now. And so I think it's really important that we like check with staff, like, hey, we're thinking about applying to this grant. Do you have the capacity to manage it? And be okay if the answer is no, because like, staff turnover is such an issue just in nonprofit work in general, but definitely within our community. And we want to make sure that we're retaining folks and that we're holding on to good people, because I think too often we lose really, really good people to other areas. And then I would also say, we talked about this in what makes a good proposal, but just ground your work in your community and in the principles of harm reduction. You know, support from the broader harm reduction community is really essential. And I think that running a program that's really grounded in harm reduction, the principles, opens up more opportunities for relationships within the community. It opens up more opportunity to connect with other staff and other programs, because this work can be really isolating. Especially right now, it can be really isolating. And so, you know, you're more likely to be funded if you're grounded in those principles and you have those connections and those community partners. Let's see, what else? Recognize the barriers of running syringe services in a state that has not legalized syringe exchange. So we know that legal status will limit public funding options, but one of the success things that I've seen is that there are programs that kind of separate these two operations. So they have like a 501c3 that's more of like the public facing, like this is our harm reduction organization. And, you know, they pass out naloxone and they like connect people to services, and they do wound care, and they, you know, all of those things, but they don't talk about syringe exchange. And then there's another entity that they have, and maybe that entity has a fiscal sponsor rather than being connected directly to the organization that is able to do some of the more underground work, which Organization A is eligible for public funds, Organization B isn't, but B can get private dollars to buy those syringes. So that's a successful model that I've seen in some places for folks to use in order to open up the eligibility for those public dollars.
I think, Genoa, you brought up so many rich examples of how partnerships and donations are golden, right? And Zach, you're right. Like, there's it's kind of this really interesting blend, right? I mean, ultimately, like the best programs are ones that have, and you know, when I say the best, right, in terms of sustainability, is when we have federal dollars, which we're not there yet entirely, right? But when we can get state funding, would be so valuable, right? Because philanthropy can't pick up, you know, all of the needs of our harm reduction programs. So I've actually seen some interesting movement, even in particularly in the state of Illinois and in Chicago, that some of the recent RFPs that have come out during COVID, the community pushed back and they said, there's no way in heck I'm going to fill out that application because it's like 20 pages long and we can't do all of that reporting. And the state took it back and they reworded it and retooled it all. So, you know, use your advocacy voice and fight back where you can, right? Because ultimately the long game is, it would be amazing if we could have negotiated, you know, percentage of like public health dollars to feed and just automatically funnel into our harm reduction programs. I think that's where we want to be and we need to be, but we need to have an open line of communication with our public officials to say, this isn't feasible, right? Like, I can't possibly go and try to find 2 Black men, 1 white woman, 2 gay men to test for HIV, right, to get this grant. I mean, like, I actually heard that was a requirement for one program. It was pretty intense, right? So anyway, so also secure the donations and, get expired naloxone. And if you're not familiar with how to get expired naloxone, go to, what's Jamie's next distro? What's next naloxone? Anyway, we'll get the link and we'll get it out there. But she has information about how to get expired naloxone and why that's okay for your program. Yeah, I guess that's all I would add to that. Virgil.
No, thank you. Thank you. I actually, that's perfect. We're going to use our final 10 minutes of the panel discussion to address question number 5, which is also, in 2020, we've had a lot of opportunities and challenges within the context of COVID-19. So can you all speak to the opportunities and challenges that COVID-19 has created when it comes to improving or securing diverse funding and sustainability?
Want me to go? Oh, go ahead, Jenna. You go
I was just
first.
gonna say,
It is opened up to anyone on the floor.
Yeah, go for it.
My apologies.
that one nice thing for us, and I know this isn't necessarily for new funding, but a lot of existing funding we already have, they've really loosened the restrictions and the reporting requirements on what they'll fund and how you have to show it. So it's worth exploring opportunities that you might not have explored before, because a lot of funders are, including the funders on this call, I'm sure are really understanding of the unique challenges that a lot of programs are facing right now. So it might be worth it to revisit folks that you hadn't thought of or thought you might not be able to get funded through. Just a thought.
I think what's been real interesting, Virgil, is it's rough out there, but when I talk to all the other foundations, and I'm not even talking just syringe access people, right? Like I'm talking about all the foundations, at least 99% of all foundations that I know of are either giving the same amount of money or more. Okay, I think I may have heard of one person that's holding back. And some of the folks that are holding back their dollars in philanthropy is because they're actually trying to see what's going to happen in the fall and maybe do a fall wave response. So one of the things that I think is really hard, and Jenna, you totally touched on it, is first of all, some funders are not open to new long-term relationships. However, because of COVID, there's all sorts of new opportunities, and some of the folks like really want to get involved. Thank you for putting the next distro in the chat, by the way, Matt. But some of the funders that are totally new to mental health and substance use, and everybody knows that is something that is a significant problem today. But some funders have like no clue where to start. So this is my big tip for you, and I'm going to put a link in the chat. But there's a philanthropy organization, and it's a regional organization. It's like every, in theory, foundation in your community. So it's either a local community, a regional, or a statewide. I really recommend going out, subscribing to their Facebook page, subscribing to their Twitter feeds, getting on their mailing list and seeing what pooled funds are available, because those are new, right? And those pooled funds are, in theory, people that have no idea what they want to fund yet because they're still figuring it out, but they're going to put money in a fund. And so there's a lot of new opportunity out there. And Zach, maybe you can touch a little bit too about, I know we've talked a lot about tapping into mutual aid funding, if that's something you want to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a really difficult time for nonprofits. I mean, it's a really difficult time for everyone, I think. But unfortunately, nonprofits aren't the ones that are being bailed out by the federal government, right? That's airlines. And so we don't have the advantages that others do. And some of the things that I've seen is like funders pivoting to COVID response, seeing like currently funded projects being prioritized. But I've also seen a lot of funders think about and implement pivoting to general operating grants. I know this was something that that we did at Age United. with most of our grant making initiatives, at least on the private funding side. And so, just telling grantees, and I emailed all of the Syringe Access Fund grantees, and I said, if you need to do this, that's fine, we understand. And so I think that it's, you have the opportunity right now to reach out to your funders and let them know what's going on. Like if you need to transition those dollars, funders are understanding right now because we're all struggling. And like I had a few organizations that were like, I can't meet what we said we would do. Can I just put this as general operating? And the answer was absolutely. So definitely, again, going back to that communication piece, just reach out and ask, because you never know. I think one thing that has come up a lot with grantees is, you can't do any sort of in-person fundraiser. You can't have your annual event. You can't have anything. And so we've seen a lot of that pivot online, but it's a challenge. And I think some of the successes I've seen are just like social media campaigns, using social media to push your apparel and different things that you sell to broader audiences. And then also hosting virtual fundraisers, I think is something that I've seen a few organizations, at least in like the HIV space, do, and they've had relative success there. And so that's something to consider. And then looking at new services, I think that most, if not all, of the Syringe Access Fund grantees have added in new roles and responsibilities since COVID started. And I think that, both COVID and the protest around racial injustice and state murder of Black people. And so I think that these organizations are doing stuff that is not in their like normal realm. And so I think that there's opportunities there to go after some funding to support that work, because I think we can all recognize that like this is just ongoing, right? Like we don't know how long we're going to be in this situation. And so I think there's opportunity there to go after some of that money that's specifically for some of these new services and new roles that organizations might be doing. And then I think looking at what opportunities your local and state agencies are promoting for COVID-19 response. Your community, their needs, and so you can go after some of those dollars to address that. I've seen some success with grantees who are getting funding from like the city or the state around homeless services and working with people who are unstably housed and helping them navigate that process, especially when they've been tested for COVID and are kicked out of oh my God, the word just went out, shelters. And so I've seen them be able to get contracts with the city to like find places for folks to sleep, which it is infuriating that like that's a thing we have to do, to find a place for someone to sleep, but like those opportunities are unfortunately there. And so I think that those kinds of conversations can be had. Mutual aid, like I don't know that I'm like the best person to talk about mutual aid. I don't know if Genoa, you have any experience here, or Virgil, you've seen anything. I mean, I know that I've seen a number of grantees that are setting things up. And I think we've seen a lot of campaigns online, or at least I've been told about them, because again, I don't have it. So don't try to send me something on Facebook. But I think we've seen, there was, I have a grantee and they set something up, and it was just all like an online thing, asking people like to support with medical expenses for some of their participants that had been diagnosed for COVID and needed support with medical expenses and bills, and things like getting them some groceries and dropping food off at their front door and things like that. So I think we've seen a lot of those campaigns come together, and I think that creates a really unique opportunity for folks to use that.
I think Zach, it's all of the mutual aid work that everyone on this call is already doing, right? I mean, we all know that the harm reduction programs, the grassroots programs, you kept operating, right? When the buck stopped, you kept working, and it's remarkable, and it's frustrating when you could be deemed as an essential service provider but not get funding as an essential service provider because you're doing all this mutual aid. And so I do think now is the time to harvest that type of momentum, to get your stories out, If you need help with volunteering, and I know that sounds kind of hard, right? Because of social distancing or physical distancing, but like if you need help making kits, right? Like there's opportunities to invite people to make kits. They can start to see what you're doing, hear a little bit more about what you're doing, because people want to help now, right? That starts to open doors. And I think you should just get paid for the work that you're already doing. And so I do believe, by the way, that I think the next wave of potential CARES Act might have some dollars for harm reduction. Well, not specific to harm reduction, right? But some type of programming related to harm reduction. So that's something to keep an eye out. But you know, you guys, if you're interested in pivoting and being contact tracers, you already know the community, right? So you could get paid to do the work that you're already doing. And then finally, I think the only other interesting thing is, you know, we've heard so much narrative around defund police, and, you know, taking that to the next step, what that actually also means is investing in community resources, and it's investing in the very things that you guys are doing today in the community, right? So start listening to that. Your city, like you know, specifically in Chicago, you know, we're a national funder, but I'm here and I'm hearing like we're going to create a 211 line, and they're going to have to, you know, man that up with a bunch of nonprofits to be able to start responding to those calls. So what does that mean, and who's that going to be?
Also, I'm thinking, I know some of you probably are mutual aid groups or work with them, but if you're not one, if you work in a nonprofit like I do, work with your local mutual aid groups. They are doing amazing work. Here in East Tennessee, we have a couple that we work really closely with, and they will be able to support your participants in ways that you can't, either capacity-wise or legality-wise. So we have a really good relationship here, and that would be the first thing on my list that has to do with COVID, because they're doing incredible things in this really challenging time that our federal and state and sometimes even local governments just aren't able to pivot to, but mutual aid can pivot so quickly. So thanks to everyone who's doing that work. And if you're not, make sure you're supporting people who are. It's really, it's mutually beneficial.
And I just wanted to add one more thing. I mean, it's kind of a plug, but I brought up virtual events and virtual fundraisers. AIDS United has a webinar on Thursday to talk about virtual events and virtual fundraisers and bring on a few folks who have implemented that and had some success. So if that's something that you are thinking about around this, like definitely check that out. I mean, you can go to aidsunited.org and get information about it, but it should be a great conversation.
All right, I'm going to do one more plug, Virgil, because I think it's important, because it's the question everybody actually like really wants to know. The next Comer cycle is opens around October 1st, and so it'll close November 1st. So we ask that you wait a year to apply. However, we understand that it's unusual circumstances right now, but I just wanted to make sure I shared with the team here that our next cycle ends on November 1st. So go to our website to find out more information.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Mary, and thank you all of you for really providing the information that you have provided today. Questions posed to you. Now, speaking of questions, Jasmine from NASCD Jasmine West is here with us. Jasmine, I know you've been monitoring the chat box, and for those of you who have questions, feel free, like I said, to include those in the chat. And if you could, Jasmine, just kind of go down the list, and we've slotted roughly 30 minutes to set aside to address whatever questions folks have for the remainder of the call.
Definitely. So we've had a handful of questions come through, and keep them coming since we have ample time to still take advantage of the expertise on this panel. First question is for Genoa. Can you speak more to how you secured the donated lock zone for your program?
Yes, it's Direct Relief, and they're amazing. And if you have a medical director that you can help sign you up for this program, we have the huge benefit of having someone because of our clinic. So that is what we needed. And I think that's usually the biggest challenge for folks, but it's a really easy process. They're amazing to work with. We are able to provide so much to our community. And if you need help with that process or getting pointed in the right direction, please let me know. My info is going to be at the end, and I would be more than happy to help out.
Great, thanks for that. Next question for Zach. You mentioned a table used for equity and diversity inclusion. So by chance, are you able to share this? Somebody was interested. It sounds like a perfect model for something that can be added and incorporated into representation for their RFAs.
Yeah, definitely. I think like my email address is on the last slide. It's zford@ageunited.org. If you reach out to me, I'm happy to share the document that we use with you. Yeah.
Great. Next one here. Is it okay to be less formal in grant applications? So being real, open, straightforward, less formal grant wording and approaches?
Great. Mary, you can speak.
I'll start. This goes with know your funder first, always, and number one. I'll tell a story because it's, but this was a long time ago and they haven't done it since, but I'll never forget reading a grant proposal and the person said to me, "You're never going to read this. I don't even know why I'm doing this," and blah, blah, blah. And they like kind of, you know, it was very unprofessional. And I picked up the phone and I called them and we had a really good conversation. And I was like, I could tell that you were really frustrated and, you know, we're still going to fund you, but like, I really recommend that you don't, you know, put all of your dirty laundry and your frustration into this document. So listen, you know, there's going to be moments where I think the details of like really candid things like, you know, drug trends and things like that are really interesting, right? And so don't worry about that kind of stuff. Just be thoughtful, you know, try not to swear. You know, our boards are reading it too. Just, you know, try to be professional enough, but, you know, we're friendly. And particularly if you're writing a grant for the very first time, I really think that AIDS United and Comer are probably the best places to write because we can be helpful and guide you. And also, you know, listen, we know, like Zach had made that comment about the massive FQHCs that are out there. We know that those folks have professional grant writers. You know, we're not looking for professional grant writers to be applying to us, right? So it's okay. You know, you don't need to be, you know, running it through an enormous amount of edits and stressing about that. Just do your best.
And I want to, oh, sorry, Zach. I just wanted to touch on a few things Mary said. One, you don't have to be a professional grant writer. I think that, you know, I've talked to a number of people who are, you know, fresh out of the gate. They're very passionate about doing this work, and they may not have experience in that particular area of nonprofit work. But I think it's really important to know that there are plenty of folks out there who are able to secure funding who, you know, don't have any type of formal education or professional experience in grant writing. And also to speak to what you stated, you know, in terms of offering feedback and guidance, right? You know, it's good to know that there are funders out there, you know, well, you're rejected, and then just leave it at that. You know, really giving you feedback that you can eventually incorporate that, right, and come back with a stronger proposal on another funding cycle.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I would add, is it okay to be less formal? I mean, no, not really. Just to be blunt, a longer like explanation of that is, I think, you know, if you're applying to public dollars, definitely not. Definitely not. If you're applying to me, if you're applying to Mary, you can certainly be less formal. But I think it's still, you still want to put some thought into it, right? Like you still want to have some, you want your ideas and your work to be easy to understand. I think one thing that that I do in my grant reviews is like I have a very strict rule that like there is no making fun of or laughing at grammatical errors or spelling mistakes or things like that. Like I'm not looking for a professional writer. I don't, like, I know that that's not why people got into this work. But I do need to see like a clear explanation of what's going on in your community and how you're addressing it. And so I think that it's helpful when that's done just a little bit more, I don't know, formally, I guess, but just, I mean, like clear, concise language is important. I think, you know, in reports, that's a different story. Like when you're submitting your report to me, like I'm the only one that reads that. So say whatever you want. It's fine. Like, in fact, I like encourage it because that's how I get most of my information outside of just talking with folks, is reading the reports. So yeah, in your reports, like use whatever language you want. But in your proposal, I think it's important, especially just like in practice, because you know not every proposal is going to be to me or to Mary. So to get into the habit of using some of that language that would be more appropriate for a public proposal. And then also, you know, sometimes there's like information that's in one proposal that can be used in another proposal, and it makes it easier to transfer some of that information when you're writing with a more formal audience in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. The questions keep coming. So in the beginning, Mary and Zach were talking about some of the struggles that you've seen programs face in terms of funding, and you mentioned a handful of things, making sure the application is layered with non-stigmatizing language, etc. But is there anything additional that you would highlight for how new organizations get recognized for possible funding? I think the emphasis is on new.
Yeah, this is really hard. It's so the Syringe Access Fund only recently started accepting proposals from like brand new organizations, like operating less than a year organizations. And it's kind of that same situation where, you know, there's like the job announcement and it's like entry level and they want 3 to 5 years of experience. Like it's that kind of thing, right? Where yeah, but I think like if you are a new program, I mean, being able to demonstrate your reason for starting the program, right? Like using local state epi data to say like this is why we're doing it, this is the problem we're addressing, making sure you have a mission that's like clear and in line with the work that you're doing, making sure that if you don't have a fiscal sponsor, if you've established yourself as a 501c3, that those things are like in place, that you have a board, that you have that support system. And I think just being able to communicate clearly what you're doing and say, you know, we're asking for this money because of this problem, and we're gonna do A, B, C, and D with the money, and we expect to have A, B, C, D happen as a result of, and just be able to really put together a really strong proposal. I think we've certainly seen new organizations come online, and I'm like, where did they come from? They are amazing. And like what has happened? I mean, I'm thinking of a couple in particular that just like over the past couple years have just popped up out of nowhere and are like superstars. And I think it's important to recognize that like that first grant you get is probably going to be relatively small. So one of the organizations I'm thinking of, like the first grant we gave them was, I think, like maybe $5,000, but we renewed them at $50,000. And so I think it's like it's important to note that like if you're a new organization, like you're not being penalized by getting a smaller amount of money. It's just you're new, you're a new partner, and so it's like, yeah, what you're saying in the proposal works, and so we're going to give you a little bit of money to see how this goes, and we're going to work with you to make sure it goes well, and then next time we can increase it. And that's kind of like, that's, you know, how things work. And then when you get lots of other money, then, you know, it starts to go the other way, and we start to decrease some of the funding.
I think I'd add 2 really simple points to that, Zach. The ones that are brand new, right, that have kind of made us say, wow, it's like, it is fun when you've got some state that in a large part, we thought there was no one doing anything out there. And then all of a sudden we see some brave souls apply to us from that state. Particularly, you know, the states that are currently illegal today. And it's just so remarkable to see, you know, who comes to the table to start running programs, and it's awesome, right? So if you are in an area that has little to no services at all, harm reduction services, or if you're the only one in the area that is doing very specific outreach to, Black trans men or our Native American population, right? Like those are the things that stand out for the really new ones. If you are another program that's right next door to 5 other programs in a metropolis, right? That's a little harder for us to grasp because we already see that there's a lot of programs there, unless if you're doing something different. And the only other thing I would add is, you don't have to be like this big. I made the comment about innovation, right? Like not everybody, it's okay, right? It's okay to just do syringes and just do naloxone. I mean, we recognize that a lot of folks are doing this out of the trunks of their cars and just saving lives, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be fancy. You're just doing the work, and that's what's incredible. And that's what we appreciate as well.
All right, so hypothetically speaking, if your proposal for funding is declined and you want to connect with the funder for feedback, or if you're a new program that's beginning harm reduction work, what is the right way to ask the funder if they can help you in this way, especially if you don't have a relationship with the funder? All hypothetical, right?
I'll just say, like, email us. Like, I mean, okay, I prefer email. I'll be honest. Like, voicemail's cool too, but like you guys, I think we're all on nonstop Zooms, and so it's kind of hard to keep up with voicemail sometimes. But if you email and just ask, can we meet? That would be amazing. The biggest tip I have for you is don't wait like 6 months to a year later, right? It's fresh. It's fresh within 30 to 60 days, right? That's probably the better time to reach out.
Yeah, and I'll add, I mean, with the Syringe Access Fund, I mean, when we send out notices that an organization's not being awarded, like we specify in the letter, we'll be giving feedback calls during these dates. So email us by this date if you want to schedule that. So my advice is like, try to do that. Of course, like if you email me outside of that, because things happen, I do my best to accommodate it. But like Mary said, I, like while I don't review our proposals, I do read all of them. But like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months later, I can't tell you what specifically wasn't strong about your proposal. And so that kind of creates more work on my end to go back and I have to read the proposal again. I think, if it's a funder that isn't specifically offering that when they decline your proposal, I think it is totally okay to respond by email and say like, thank you so much for notifying me of this decision. Can you please provide me with a little bit of feedback for why it wasn't funded? Totally fine. I think like doing it as an email takes some pressure off. You're not asking to schedule a call, and they can like, if they want to call you, some funders will, they prefer to like say these things than have them written down. But some will just email you back, but that's totally acceptable. I think in terms of like the relationship building aspect, so reaching out to a funder when an RFP is open, or if there's no RFP, my recommendation for how, because I've done just working in nonprofits, like we all do development work all the time, and Age United is interesting in that it's an intermediary. So like I have funders and then I am a funder, and so I've done development stuff for a long time, just as a nature of being in nonprofit, and I think that like I appreciate when an organization reaches out to me and says like, hey, I heard about the Syringe Access Fund. It sounds like y'all are doing some work that's aligned with us. Can we talk about the work we're doing? I appreciate when an organization emails me and wants to like share about the work they're doing, hear about the work Age United is doing. I don't appreciate when someone emails me and says like, hey, can you fund me? Just like, because it happens like with no like descriptive anything, just like, hey, do you have money? And I think that goes back to just kind of, it's just that like,
we have boards, right, Zach? So like, we can't just like make decisions like in a vacuum, like at any time. Like we actually have like open grant periods because they're grant review periods with our boards. And so Sometimes there's some discretionary funding, right? That we can maybe move stuff around, but it's challenging and it still requires approval. So that's, I think, another tip to add in there. And also the cold call is totally cool, unless if you're going to ask me a bunch of things that are in my head, like I have to like pivot, right? And like Zach said, pull up your notes and pull up your documents to be prepared for that conversation. It's, you know, we review, you know, several agreements. So it's just, you know, give us the minute to do that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I don't know, I had a thought, but I lost it. So.
All right, so I just want to keep a reminder, we have 10 minutes left for the call by my time estimation. So, and we will have the contact information for the panelists on the final slide for those whose questions have not been able to get answered. And feel free to reach out to our lovely panelists here today to ask whatever questions we're not able to be answered during this portion of the webinar.
All right, next question. How does a harm reduction organization turn from competition to collaboration when there are limited funds available in the region for services?
The struggle is real.
Right?
This is a really hard question. You guys are, I mean, it's a really hard question. It is a reality, but it's a hard question. I think for us, it's really helped to be supportive and not fake supportive, like to your face, but really actually support other people applying for the same money. I know sometimes, not just harm reduction organizations, but I mean, if it's just like public health funding in general, sometimes we're in competition with like the health department or another community-based organization. And if you have relationships with those people to begin with, it really does make it easier. And if you can genuinely support each other, I mean, there's no denying, you know, you're applying for the same funds. You usually know that you're going for the exact same money. But I would say that that softens the blow a little bit. And if you can help support the folks who don't get funded, if you do get funded, it's going to keep that relationship building going. That's my only advice.
I love that you said sharing supplies, I think is a huge part of it. And also, if you have been funded for 20 years, right, through the same funder, you know, there's going to be a point where, you know, potentially that relationship is going to need to wind down. And hopefully it's because you've become stronger and you've become more sustainable and you've received like different types of funding resources. That's when it might be thoughtful as like kind of the big guy of the space to like take a step back and really allow some of the smaller organizations to step in. You know, we really love to support the small organizations because they have limited staffing and time to be able to apply. We're like the right people for them, right? And so, but you know, I always think like it'd be kind of neat. I think Maine did it for a while, right? Where you can kind of apply into a fund, right? And you're part of a larger fund for the state, and then, and it's not state run, right? Unlike California, but it's a fund within a particular state, and then we could fund the state and then, or that fund, and then hopefully it's peer driven, right? And you guys decide where the money goes throughout the community. I think that would be a neat model that moves the power and shifts the power from me as a funder to you as the community, but it would require some lift, right, on your behalf to build a coalition and to like have a joint application for your community or state. It's just an idea. That's something I'm open to.
And I just want to share like a story of our last round of funding on this note. I had an organization that that emailed me, and they were, because the last cycle of the Syringe Access Fund is a little different than it has been in the past. We had a little bit less money to grant out, and so it was the cycle of funding was structured a bit different. But I had an organization reach out, and they said, hey, like I've heard about what's going on, and I just want to let you know that like we're good for the next year. Like you don't have to put us on the list or worry about us. And I don't think that I have ever been like so impressed with a program. I mean, it was like, it made me want to fund them so badly. I mean, I know that they don't, right? Like they didn't need it. But I think it was just such a like community collaborative spirit of like, we're good for the next 12 months. So like, please use that money elsewhere. And so I think that that's something that like organizations should be constantly asking themselves, because when you receive money from an initiative, it means someone else didn't. And so I think it's really important, like I said, those priorities of like who an organization is looking to support, like, do you really truly match that? Because if not, like there's a reason why we want to focus on the smaller grassroots programs, like especially the ones that are coming online in states that have never had programs. It's because we want to create the same access to services that folks have in states that have had these programs for years, and have really solid programs to go to. And as much as we wish we could fund every single one with like tons and tons and tons of money, the reality is that we don't have that. And so we want to make sure that we're creating new services and new sustainable services in new areas. And so I think it's an important exercise to go through as an organization of like, who are our funders? What do their RFPs look like? What are their priorities? Do we still fit this? And if you don't really, to really think about like how you might use other funds to cover that grant.
All right, now I'm going to cut us off there for the Q&A and move to the final slide, which has information on there for our panelists here today. So for those who are still on the call, feel free to jot down these email addresses. I want to also thank you, Zach. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Genoa, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today on this call and really help dive into this conversation of funding diversity and program sustainability. And like I said, for those of you who are still on the call, whose questions were not able to be answered, feel free to jot down this contact information and shoot those emails over to our lovely panelists here to pose any of those questions to them today. And I also would like to thank Jasmine West for monitoring the chat box. Thank you. You have been a lifesaver.
I would be remiss if I didn't name that. It is World Hepatitis Day. So I would also like to thank the entire panel, also all of the attendees for their questions, and thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Give folks a minute or two more for those who may not be finished jotting down that information, and we will close out our webinar. And we thank you to everyone who was able to join us here today. We greatly appreciate it.